Welcome to part 3 of What's Robbing the Tone. Talking about a few points I missed about the bridge and moving on to the nut of guitars, mostly electrics. So I'm moving in with the camera on the bridge saddles of this Ibanez guitar, hoping the autofocus can stay in focus. The bridge saddles are these things, there are 6 of them sticking up towards the camera, and where the string passes over each bridge saddle there needs to be a small notch, because if there isn't, then the string when plucked may move about on top of the sort of knife edge of the bridge saddle, and that will rob the tone. So there should be a small notch. If there isn't, of course you can make one if you have the right kind of file. I've even seen a guitar repairer who will put an old pair of strings on and then tap each string to make a dent in the knife edge of each bridge saddle. I prefer a proper small file. And again, using the Ibanez for illustration, you see that between the bridge and where the strings are anchored there's quite a long run of string, which can give you unwanted resonances while you're playing and just spoil the sound of a guitar. I have another guitar, a Hofner, that really does have this problem, and I've wound in and out of the strings a strip of sort of foam, you know, like wetsuit material, and that completely damps that problem. And now with the sort of bridge where the strings ride over saddles which are individually height adjustable, it's really hard to focus on this, but each bridge saddle here, and there are 6, one for each string, has sort of feet formed from grub screws which go and stand on the top of the tremolo, and those are used for adjusting each string height, but there are 2 per string, so if you get them unevenly adjusted you can end up with one not even touching the metal surface, and therefore again an imperfect contact metal on metal. It's very hard to focus on this, but can you see those sort of little feet underneath formed by the grub screws? And now the guitar I was playing at the beginning of this part, it's a Hagstrom from the 70s. It has a floating bridge and the classic jazz type, because it's a hollow guitar. It's sitting, the whole thing is ebony, and it's sitting on the surface, which is made of laminated birch in this case. The contact between each end of the bridge needs to be good, and needs actually to be shaped to fit the curve of the top. It's an arch top, so if this is poor and you can see light, or you can get a piece of paper underneath, then it can be fixed with a piece of abrasive paper and painstaking work using the bridge itself on the sandpaper to take away ebony until the whole thing sits very snugly on the top of the archtop guitar. So the nut. All guitars have a nut. You see the cream coloured thing? Looks a bit shiny like plastic. That's bone. That one's a very old Hofner one, also bone. Here's a bass guitar that also has one. Here's the Stratocaster. Now let's look at the nut in isolation. This is a piece of a broken one. So this is a bone nut from a Patrick Egel Berlin. What I really want to show you here is that the bass string end has wider grooves than the treble string end, and it isn't perfectly symmetrical. The broken bit, it's easy to show you that the grooves have been filed. You see the profile of the nut, how it rises from to camera right. Well, the grooves also rise from left to camera right, and that's so that the place where the string leaves the nut is almost a point on this side. And also the grooves have been filed with the optimum direction to run straight to the relevant tuner. So this is a well-made nut. Important thing, apart from it being a well-made nut, thinking about the energy transfer, this is one point where the strings are held. It needs to be good and rigid, and the energy loss pathway that could occur between here all through the neck and the body to the bridge to the other end of the string is that the nut needs to be well seated. It needs to fit extremely well in the bottom of the nut groove. It needs to fit really well where it's glued on the edge of the fingerboard, and if there's a shim underneath, it needs to be hardwood, not some piece of paper or something like that. I mean, hopefully there isn't a shim underneath, but there may be. And that will rob energy from the string. So yeah, I've seen nuts made also of good and bad material. This is a good nut. It's on a Stratocaster and it's made of bone, but very often you find white plastic on cheaper guitars, and there's a good version of white plastic, one make of which is Tusk, T-U-S-Q, which is said to be a really good substitute for bone. But I've seen brass, I've seen graphite, I've even seen aluminium, and I wouldn't recommend that, I don't think. So, well-seated nut, no soft shim underneath, and I've already talked about the way the nut should be made with the correct kind of groove for each string. And just while we're here, we can see string trees. These two things here are string trees, and they hold the strings down to give a better break angle over the nut. I talked about break angle when I was talking about bridge. So the break angle over the nut needs to be as steep as it can while maintaining the functionality of the tuners. A Gibson has a headstock that's raked back from the fingerboard. The Stratocaster doesn't. It just has a headstock which sits a little bit lower, but for the treble strings, the string trees help to make the break angle a bit steeper, and therefore the pressure from the string to the nut to be nice and high. Another thing that really does matter with the nut is how deep the string grooves are filed, because that will determine the action of the string above the frets. I'm looking here at the first fret. This is my Stratocaster, which plays fine, and string action seems to be about 1/4 of a millimetre. So the grooves have to be the right direction, the right shape, the right width for the string, but they also have to be the right depth. to give you the right height of the string above the frets. Otherwise the strings will start kissing the frets, especially with open chords, as you play it. And of course the nut, the array of grooves in the nut has to mimic the radius of curvature of the frets, and that's specific to the model of guitar. I think this one is the Stratocaster is probably like something like a 10-inch radius. In other words, if there was a great circle, this would be a part of a great circle with a 10-inch radius. I did have a radius gauge somewhere to show you. Yes, here. So I have a set of these. You can buy radius gauges for measuring the radius of the fretboard. Okay. Oh yes, if the string action is too high because the nut slots are not filed deep enough, then it will be harder to play the guitar because you have to use more pressure to push down the strings, especially at this end of the fretboard. And the further you have to push them down, the more likely it is that you're going to stretch them out of tune as well. So yeah, I think the recommendation for most guitars is 18 to 20 thousandths of an inch. And another very important issue with the nut, in fact it's determined by the guitar fretboard width, but the string spacing, if it's too crowded for your fingers, the size of your fingers or your style of playing, then you will be crowding your fingers and you'll be touching strings accidentally and muting notes and so on. So it's possible, actually with this one you can see that there's a little bit of room to open up the string spacing, taking the outer strings closer to the edge of the fingerboard. That's if you were making a new nut anyway. But this suits me fine. This is factory standard.